Hello again, fellow Inklings. Here's your Lewis fun fact for the week. So when C.S. Lewis's wife, Joy, died, he wrote a small book about his grief called A Grief Observed, and he published it under a fake name, N.W. Clerk. Why? Because Lewis was, by that point, the most famous Christian apologist in the English-speaking world. He didn't want anyone picking up his book and thinking, the great defender of the faith has lost his. It took years before people figured out N.W. Clark was C.S. Lewis. And when they did, some were genuinely surprised. The man who seemed to have all the answers, well, he really didn't. Not at that moment. Today, we're starting a new series. And honestly, it's the hardest one for me in this Recover Christianity project. We're beginning a series called How Do We Make Sense of Suffering? And before we go any further, I want to start with something bigger than my own story. Every religion that has ever existed was formed in one way or another around a single unavoidable problem. Human beings suffer. And we cannot make peace with that without some kind of explanation or framework or hope. That problem doesn't disappear just because we've inherited a faith that claims to have an answer to it. It follows us into adulthood, into tragedy, into the quiet hours when nothing else makes sense. It is, in the end, the question we cannot escape. And like Lewis, I want to be upfront with you. I do not have this figured out, but I'm using my own name. I've been putting this series off for a long time because this is the question I feel least equipped to answer. So today I want to start somewhere personal and share some of my own personal story with suffering. As you might have seen my LinkedIn, you might think that I've had a pretty charmed life. Successful career, married for almost 40 years, founder of a few companies and organizations. In a lot of ways, that's true. There's a lot that lives below the waterline. For example, when I was 31, I was co-founder and CEO of a family software business with my two brothers. They were both older. After about 6 years, my middle brother and I couldn't agree on the direction of the company, and he convinced everyone else in the family, including our parents, to side with him. I was fired in what felt like a courtroom scene. My entire family and their attorneys were literally in the room. I felt like Esau, betrayed by the people who were supposed to be my foundation. That season fractured my family for many, many years, and it broke something in me that took a long time to even begin to understand. I also need to be honest. During that same season, I had been involved in some moral failure of my own. My firing had nothing to do with that, and they didn't even know about that. But I believed what was happening to me was God's judgment and His wrath. That belief made everything worse. It's one thing to suffer. It's another to be convinced that you absolutely deserve it. A few years later, I became CEO of another software company out in Colorado Springs where we moved. The pressure was enormous, and the anxiety I'd carried my whole life became unimaginable. I had to resign because of anxiety and many panic attacks. And that was not long after one of my dearest friends died at my feet in a rock climbing accident. I witnessed that. I felt terrified, ashamed, like a burden to everyone who loved me, and not knowing whether I would be even able to support my family. Then in my early 40s, my son Colin was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at 16 years old. I remember getting that call, and my first reaction was to lie down on the floor of the shower with the water running and just weep. I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed before. He survived, thank God. But over the years that followed, the faith he'd grown up with, somehow he couldn't hold on to anymore. The day he told me he was an atheist was its own kind of grief. But that story is part of the whole thing that gave birth to this Recover Christianity project. After that came prostate cancer in my 50s, and I had to have my prostate removed. That was both scary and was an assault to what it felt like even to be a man. Then both of my parents declined with dementia, and both died within a year of each other in 2019 and 2020. but both were debilitated by the disease of dementia and suffered with it for years. Later, I found myself on the other side of suffering. I was part of a business decision that deeply wounded someone I cared about. Rather than feeling like Job, like before, this time I felt like Judas. It's still one of the decisions I regret the most. And around that same time, I developed a skin condition that lasted 18 months. 4 dermatologists, including going to the Mayo Clinic, 4 biopsies, and no one could figure it out. I'd wake up at night with my whole body itching, and I'd cry out, but only to find no relief. To this day, even if a small rash appears or a little bump, I feel real fear that it's coming back. You know what? Underneath all of it, my whole life, I've had just this generalized anxiety, a lingering fear that something terrible with my health is always just around the corner. It's not only personal. Some days I can barely read the news. War, children dying, disasters wiping out entire communities. All of it in real time, on our phones, whether we want it or not, it's there. I find myself asking how a loving God can watch all this, everywhere, all at once, and not intervene. I tell you all this not to compete in some kind of suffering contest. All of you I know can relate. And I have friends who've lost children, so their pain is far worse than anything I've ever walked through. I tell you this because when I say I don't have clean answers, I mean it in the most personal way possible. So here's the question underneath all of it. It's the same one Lewis asked after Joy died. He wrote this, and I want to recite it slowly. Go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. C.S. Lewis said that in his grief. God didn't feel like a loving father. God felt like a cosmic scientist running an experiment. C.S. Lewis said he felt like a rat in a laboratory where he was being tortured just to see how he would react. What gets me about that isn't that Lewis lost his faith, because he didn't. What gets me is that he refused to fake it. He told the truth about what it felt like, even though he was, by reputation, the guy with all the answers. I've felt some of that, the door slammed, the silence, the sense that something has gone very wrong and nobody's going to come to explain it. If you felt that too, then this series is for you. There's a man in the Old Testament named Job, and his story is the oldest sustained meditation on suffering in the Bible. The very first verse tells you he's blameless, he's upright, a man of integrity. He hasn't done anything wrong. And God allows Satan to take everything from him, his children, his health, everything. Later, God himself admits it. He tells Satan, you incited me to ruin him without any reason. That's in Job 2:3. God admits Job was ruined and that it was without cause and that he did it. If that's what happens to the most righteous man in the story, what does that mean for the rest of us? Job's friends try to explain it. You must have done something wrong. You need to repent and this will stop. And Job refuses that. He insists he's innocent. He argues with God. He demands some kind of explanation. And when God finally answers from a whirlwind, he doesn't explain really anything. He just asks Job, well, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? In Job 38:4. No reason given, just a reminder that there's a mystery here bigger than any of us. I've read that ending a lot of times, and I still don't fully like it. Honestly, I don't like this system that is part of creation called suffering, especially when I'm in the midst of a very dark season. But here's where I want to land today. There's a moment in the Gospels I keep coming back to. It's the moment Jesus is on the cross and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew 27:46. For me, it's the most hopeful verse in the whole Bible. Not because it makes suffering easier, it doesn't, but because of what it means that Jesus said it. God, in human flesh, experienced that exact feeling, that abandonment, desolation, the door slammed shut. He told the truth about what it really felt like. I heard James Finley, one of the faculty that I had at the Living School, say this was the brief moment Jesus became an atheist. I find that, and he meant it to be funny, but also it's strangely comforting. If that's what following Jesus looks like, then my dark seasons aren't a sign that I've wandered off the path. In fact, they might be the path itself. I told you I've been putting this series off. Part of why is that I was afraid that writing about suffering without any clean answers would somehow make this whole Recover Christianity project less credible. But the Bible, as I've learned, is full of people who didn't have clean answers. Job didn't, David didn't, Paul didn't, Jesus didn't, not in that moment on the cross. What they had was honesty with God and the stubborn conviction that God was present, even in the silence. Now that's lament. And lament is not the opposite of faith. It's one of its most honest expressions. In Psalm 13:1 says, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long?" That's in the Bible. And I don't think that was an accident to put it there. There's one more thing I want to say because it's been sitting underneath everything I've shared today. For a long time, I've carried something like a grievance against God. I know how strange that sounds, that I kind of feel like need to forgive God, as if God needed some kind of pardon. Forgiveness is just letting go. It's the same thing, letting go of a grievance. Sometimes we need to let go of grievance against God. But honestly, that's what it's felt like, that I've had a quiet case I've been building, evidence I've kept without quite admitting I was keeping it. And I know holding on to that only hurts me. Not letting go hurts me. Near the end of Job's story, after everything, after the whirlwind, after God's questions that explain nothing, Job says something remarkable. "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." That's in Job 42:5. See, nothing is undone. His children are still gone, but something in him shifts, not because the loss now makes sense, but because he's encountered and somehow experienced God directly. And the case he'd been building up no longer has the same grip. Well, I know I, for one, am not there yet. Not fully. But I want this series to be part of my own slow letting go of that grievance. So here's where we're starting. Not with an answer, not with a tidy explanation, with permission. Permission to not have this figured out. Permission to tell God the truth about what you're going through, even if what you're going through is anger or confusion or what you feel like is a door bolted shut from the inside. That's not the end of the conversation with God. It might actually be where an honest conversation begins. So fellow Inklings, until next week, I'll see you later. But whenever you're in your own dark night and whatever grievance you might be carrying, may you know you're not in it alone. So go in grace and peace.